Hey guys, this is Joe. Thanks for tuning in today. If you were to ask any Jewish child, what is the source for the holiday of Hanukkah, they will gladly answer you that it is because the Maccabees, the Hashmonaim, found a jar of oil, not just any jar of oil, but a jar of oil that was stamped with the stamp of the high priest as being absolutely pure, and it only had enough oil for one day. Yet they decided to fill the menorah to its capacity and let the lights burn, and miraculously they didn't burn for one day or for 2 days, they burned for 8 entire days, and because of that, this is why we celebrate the festival of Hanukkah. If you delve into the historic literature on the topic, in fact look at the contemporary documents that were written, the first and second book of Maccabees, written between the first book of Maccabees, we're talking about written between the time of 130 to 103 before the Common Era, and the second book of Maccabees written in the year 124, they do not mention the miracle of the oil at all. If you go a little further in history, to the time of Josephus Flavius, Yosef ben Mattatyahu, we find him mentioning the festival of lights and Hanukkah, but once again we find no mention of the lighting of candles, although presumably you could argue that by Josephus's time there was already candles being lit. The source that we have for this miracle of the oil is coming from the Babylonian Talmud, which was sealed in about 500 of the Common Era. That being said, there is room, and indeed this video will argue that the lighting of candles is indeed ancient, going back to the time of the Hasmoneans. Aside from the Babylonian Talmud, we also have several sources within the body of Talmudic literature that would seem to point us to the lighting of the candles as one of the customs of celebration. We start first with the Megillat Ta'anit, which is the oldest piece of Tanaic literature that we possess today. And it mentions that on the 25th of Kislev, we have the miracle of Hanukkah, and that you shouldn't fast or have eulogies on this day, and the festival lasts for 8 days. Now, on the Megillat Ta'anit, we also have a commentary that was written on it called Scolion. Now, the Scolion, we don't know exactly when they were written. There is room, according to Vered Noam, the author of the critical scientific edition of the Megillat Ta'anit. They found no less than 3 different versions of the Scolion. We have the version coming from Parma, Italy. We have the Oxford edition, which is obviously coming from Oxford, England. And finally, we have a third one, which was basically a intertwining of the 2 Scolion that we have. Basically, the Megillat Ta'anit is a list of holidays / fast days, most of them happening during the period of the Hasmoneans, which basically prohibits Jews from fasting and having eulogies on those days. The Scolion are basically commentaries explaining why we don't fast on those days. And between the Oxford and the Parma edition, there are several contradictions. So later on in history, it was taken to go and line it up with the Talmud and with, the most pro-rabbinic way of writing it, and make it into a third edition, which is edition you find in most non-critical texts today when you buy the Megillat Ta'anit. And within the Megillat Ta'anit there, we have the mentioning of the miracle of the jar of oil, which is coming indeed from the Oxford edition of the Scolion. But it would seem from the reading of Jewish sources during the Middle Ages, especially the work of the Or Zarua, that the text of the jar of oil that we have in today's Oxford edition is a very late edition. As in the book, the Or Zarua, he quotes from the Scolion and mentions nothing of the jar of oil. In the Parma edition, we do have a mentioning of the Hasmoneans finding a jar of oil and them lighting the menorah from that jar of oil and it burning for the 8-day period, but not the particular jar of oil that was sealed by the Kohen Gadol, and that it was only enough for 1 day, but instead burned for 8 days. That is lacking within the Parma edition. However, the Parma edition, you could argue and say that indeed there is room for the insertion of this jug, and it could fit within the story as we have it written within the Babylonian Talmud. The final piece of ancient literature that we have within this survey of ancient sources outside of the Talmud, we're going to dive into the Talmud in a second, is that of Megillat Antiochus. Now, Megillat Antiochus, it's very, very difficult to date. It's dating sometime between the 2nd and 5th centuries of the Common Era. More traditional sources have dated it as a contemporary work of the Hasmoneans, or alternatively from the students of Hillel and Shammai, but it seems from scientific analysis that it is dating from a little bit of a later period, from the 2nd century, so meaning maybe just after the time of the students of Hillel and Shammai. It could be that the students of Hillel and Shammai might be responsible for the work, and that work does mention the miracle of the jar of oil. So you might be asking me at this point, well, wait a second, everything that you presented over there just shows us that we don't have a source for the miracle of the jar of oil before the sealing of the Talmud. But as mentioned before, if we were to take the earliest date of Megillat Antiochus and we were to take the Scolion and assume that it is written before the Talmud Bavli, which indeed it could be, there is room to say that within academic circles. And then D, there is much discussion about the book of Maccabees itself, with scholars from the time of Abraham Geiger arguing that it was a work that definitely has Sadducean influence. And if you recall, Rabbinic Judaism is a direct descendant of Pharisaic Judaism, and the Sadducees were rivals. Geiger wants to make it that as if it was a partisan work. Other scholars argue with him on that, but nonetheless, if we make this lineup that perhaps it's a Sadducean work, and that Megillat Ta'anit, the Scolion on Megillat Ta'anit, is going from the time, let's say, of Hillel and Shammai, which could be argued, and the Megillat of Antiochus happening just a little after, on the earlier side of the dating, then there definitely is room. And we could fill that in with Talmudic practice. We find several different sources for blessings on the Hanukkah candles dating to the 3rd century, late 2nd, early 3rd century of the Common Era, by Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi and by Rav, who was also roughly living at the same time over there, in both the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, and in the Jerusalem Talmud, the Talmud Yerushalmi. We find within the portion of Talmud that mentions the miracle of the jug of oil that the students of Hillel and Shammai had a debate as to how to light candles. Not if to light candles, but how you light the candles. With Hillel arguing that you go up in holiness, start out with 1 and go with 8, and then Shammai arguing that you go down, you start with 8 and you go down every single day. And obviously the custom today is following after the disciples of Hillel. So putting that together with the assumption of the Scolion being at roughly that time, and the Megillat Antiochus roughly at that time, we have solid evidence of Jews observing the lighting of candles at least from the time of Hillel and Shammai. And when did the time of Hillel and Shammai commence? So we have a portion of Talmud that mentions that Hillel ruled for about 100 years before the destruction of the temple. Now, if we take that back, the temple being destroyed, that's the second temple that is, the second temple being destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era, and subtract back 100 years, that puts us back at 30 BCE, which would mean that's the time that Hillel started ruling. It could be that there was already lighting before that, and the time that he started ruling over Israel, meaning that he had established disciples. We see 130 years after the Maccabean revolt, there is not an argument of if one should light candles, but rather the argument is how you should light candles. And this, for me, is clear evidence that this is a very, very old custom. Now, the obvious question on all this is why we do not find the sources, the early sources. Like, for example, there is a prayer that is inserted within the Grace After Meals within Judaism and within the daily Shmona Esrei Amidah prayer called Al Hanisim. And within the prayer of Al Hanisim, there is no mention of the lighting of candles. Not to mention the sources that we have previously mentioned, the book of Maccabees, both the first one and the second one, and the fact that Josephus doesn't mention it as well. One could argue, well, it's all well and nice what you're trying to bring over here, but, the earliest sources do not mention anything about it. So even if we were to give up on that aspect, it could very well be that this minhag, this custom of lighting candles, did exist from the outset. But the Jews of the land of Israel concentrated more on the victory of the Hasmoneans and the rededication of the temple as they had the temple service. Once we get to the destruction of the temple and no more temple and the loss of Jewish sovereignty of the land of Judea, maybe the holiday shifted more. Alternatively, we have in Babylon at that time was the center of the Jewish population. And within Babylon, they were under Seleucid rule for well after the time of the Maccabean revolt. And to have a festival that focuses on the more nationalistic is a bit of a misnomer, but using it for lack of a better term during this period, to have more of a patriotic kind of like, yeah, we beat them, in a place where you're being ruled by them, could be a little bit controversial, and therefore they focused on the lighting of the candles. However it may be, I do believe that the lighting of the candles is, as Jewish tradition says, coming from the outset, from the time of Judah Maccabee, and for whatever reason, within the land of Israel, it either A, just was not the main focus, or B, there's a bit of a difference going on between the Pharisees and the Sadducees in regards to the importance and the lighting of the candles. Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you got benefit out of that, please make sure to like and subscribe.